It was a humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief of Blue Ridge, stepped out of his car. The air was thick with the heat of late summer, the sun beating down on the small North Carolina town nestled in the rolling hills. Dressed in worn jeans, a plaid shirt, and scuffed sneakers, Richard didn't look the part of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. But that was the point. Blue Ridge was a town with a reputation, a place where whispers of misconduct and corruption had long plagued the police department. As a black man stepping into a leadership role, Richard knew he had to see the precinct unfiltered, without the polished meetings, the rehearsed introductions, or the smiles that masked the truth. He needed to see how his officers really behaved when no one was watching. Richard had been appointed chief of police just days ago, but he had chosen not to publicize his arrival, wanting to keep it a secret until the day he could truly observe his team. The undercover operation wasn't meant to be a dramatic reveal. It was simple. He wanted to get the real picture of the precinct, not the one portrayed through formal presentations and rehearsed speeches. As he walked through the precinct's parking lot, the noise of officers coming and going filled the air. Richard scanned the area, noting the casual chatter between officers, the occasional glance in his direction. But no one seemed to recognize him. That didn't surprise him. His appointment had been announced quietly, and he had intentionally kept his arrival low-key. No one knew the man in jeans and a baseball cap was their new chief. He paused for a moment and took a deep breath. He was no stranger to resistance. He had faced adversity his entire career. But this mission would be unlike any other. The weight of his task to root out the toxicity festering within the department pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had always believed in doing things differently. This wasn't about meeting officers in sterile, official settings. This was about seeing the real Blue Ridge Police Department, the one behind closed doors. He adjusted the brim of his cap and walked toward the building. The precinct was alive with activity, but Richard blended in seamlessly. Inside, the buzz of phones and conversations filled the air. The smell of stale coffee lingered, a familiar scent in any law enforcement office. The tiled floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Richard walked past desks and officers huddled together, some laughing, others reviewing paperwork. No one paid him much attention. He walked quietly past, taking in the scene with a trained eye. The moment felt like any other Tuesday morning, but Richard knew something no one else did. Today would change everything. It wasn't until he neared the break room that anything out of the ordinary happened. A sharp voice called out, "Hey, you!" Richard turned to see Officer Daniels, a tall, white officer with a smug grin, striding toward him. Behind him, a few other officers leaned against the wall, watching with interest. This was it. "This isn't a shelter," Daniels sneered. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his career, but the venom in Daniels' voice made his skin crawl. This wasn't just an insult. It was a clear sign of prejudice. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels wasn't finished. "Didn't you hear me?" he barked. "Get out. We don't need people like you hanging around here." Laughter erupted from the group of officers behind him. Richard froze. The laughter wasn't just a reaction to a joke. It was the kind of laughter reserved for someone who was made to feel small, someone who was belittled in front of others. It was intimidation, pure and simple. Should I confront him now? Richard wondered, his heart pounding. Should he challenge the officer in front of his peers? Or should he let this play out further? Before he could decide, Daniels stepped even closer. His voice had risen to make sure the whole room heard him. "Get out of here now!" Daniels' face was red with anger. The other officers looked on, a few even snickering. And then, without warning, Daniels spit directly in Richard's face. The room erupted in laughter. One officer slapped the table in amusement. Another muttered something about, showing the riffraff their place. For a long moment, Richard's world slowed down. He could feel the warm saliva dripping down his cheek, could feel his breath hitch in his chest as everything went silent. The room felt like it was closing in. He could hear the laughter grow louder as they realized how far they could push him. But Richard was not just any man. He had spent years fighting injustice, and this was no different. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped the spit from his face, his movements slow and deliberate. He said nothing, but his calm demeanor spoke volumes. His heart pounded, but he stood tall. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice steady. Daniels smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Laughter rang out again. But Richard wasn't interested in their mockery. Instead, he turned and walked down the hallway, leaving Daniels and his audience behind. The next few minutes felt like a lifetime as Richard made his way to the precinct's main office. An intercom crackled to life, announcing, "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately." The officers shuffled into the room, some carrying coffee mugs, others laughing and chatting. Daniels still wore his smug grin, thinking his morning antics had gone unnoticed. But when the doors opened, Richard stepped in, carrying a folder bearing the precinct's official seal. He stood just out of view, watching as the room filled. Some officers were still chuckling about what had happened earlier, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. At the front of the room, Captain Harris cleared his throat. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, we welcome our new chief." Richard stepped forward. The room fell silent. He walked to the podium, his footsteps steady, his presence commanding. The room seemed to freeze. Officers exchanged confused glances as Daniel's smirk began to fade. "My name is Richard Nelson," Richard said, his voice calm but with the weight of authority behind it. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. The officers who had once laughed were now staring at Richard, trying to reconcile the man standing before them with the one they had just humiliated. Richard took a breath. He could feel the tension in the room, but he wasn't finished. "When I arrived this morning, I came in plain clothes," he continued. "I wanted to see the department as it truly is, not through the rehearsed lens of press conferences or formalities, and what I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the officers tried to speak, but Richard raised a hand. "Let me be clear," he said. "In my brief time here, I've already witnessed behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but downright unacceptable. The culture of this department ends today." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's face had gone pale. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. Richard's gaze locked onto Daniel's, who now stood with his arms crossed, his face crimson. Richard stepped closer to the podium, his voice sharp but controlled. "Respect is not optional," he declared. "Respect is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we serve." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me remind you of something. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." His words were like a blade cutting through the room. Daniels flinched, shifting his weight, unable to hold Richard's gaze. Richard turned his attention to the other officers, who now stood frozen, the weight of his words settling on their shoulders. "I understand change is difficult," Richard said, his voice softer but no less powerful. "But let me be clear, there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium, slowly moving toward Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice cold, "you represent everything that's broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath we all swore to uphold, and the community we are supposed to protect. Daniel stammered, his voice shaking. Chief, I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Richard interrupted. You didn't care to know. You didn't stop for a second to think before you acted. You assumed that the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption, that's what has destroyed this department's reputation. The room was silent. Every officer stood frozen, the weight of Richard's words heavy in the air. Richard turned to face the group. This is not just one man's mistake, he said. This is a culture that has been allowed to fester and grow. A culture where bullying, disrespect, and prejudice are tolerated. That ends now. He stepped back to the podium, his tone firm and resolute. I've spent my career fighting for justice, both on the streets and within the walls of places like this. Change won't happen overnight, but I promise you this. As long as I am chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability. Richard paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. And let me be clear, this is just the first of many changes. Gasps filled the room. Daniels' face turned even redder, the sweat now visible on his brow. He clenched his fists, but Richard stood unfazed. This isn't about punishment, Richard said calmly. It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to that standard, this isn't the place for you. The room remained still. The officers shuffled uneasily as Richard's gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with each officer. If you're ready to be better, to do better, then we'll move forward together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way. The meeting ended in heavy silence. Daniels stormed out of the room, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. The rest of the officers left quietly, avoiding Richard's gaze, each lost in their thoughts. Back in his office, Richard sat at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of entrenched attitudes wouldn't change overnight. Some officers would never adapt. But Richard wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang. Chief, Captain Harris said, his voice tentative. I wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have. Richard smiled slightly. Thanks, Captain, but the real work starts now. I need a full review of Daniel's history. Complaints, incident reports, everything. You got it, Harris replied. And Chief, I think you shook a few of them today, in a good way. Richard hung up, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction before diving into the mountain of paperwork ahead.